Hey guys, it's Ice again. Big review for you today. This is the K-Bar Marine Combat. Very famous blade. I've had a heck of a lot of requests to do a review on this blade. Now I'll get over the stats first, then I'll give you some history, and then I'll go into my opinions on this knife. The blade length is 7 inches. The weight is 0.7 pounds. The overall length is 11 and 7/8 inches, so pretty much a foot. It is a clip point blade design, has a black powder coat. The steel is 1095 CroVan with a 56 to 58 Rockwell hardness rating. It has a flat grind. The blade is 0.165 inches thick. It's made in the USA in Olean, New York. The handle is stamped leather, it's not wood. The edge angle is 20 degrees. And lastly, the price. If you were to buy this from K-Bar, it would be $107.77 off their website. However, you can get this a lot of other places for a lot cheaper. For example, I got this from a small business near where I live for about $91. The cheapest that I've found is on Amazon for $59.29 with free shipping. The sheath comes in leather and Zytel, which is reinforced glass. Alright, now I will get into some history. Alright, so in World War II, the United States military was looking for a knife better than the one they had to issue to most of their military forces in World War II. On December 9th, 1942, this knife was submitted to the U.S. Marine Corps. Now, the military loved it, and it became standard issue to the Marines, Army, Navy, Coast Guard, and UDTs in World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam War, and Iraq War. So this is statistically the single most famous blade design ever produced. It's still used today in law enforcement, in military operations. It's still made the same way they were made 72 years ago in Olean, New York. Absolutely legendary blade, full of American history and tradition. The original name was the 1219C2, later designated the USMC Mark II combat knife. Also goes by a bunch of other names like the K-Bar Marine Combat, Combat Utility. I've heard a bunch of different names for this. Now I'll go over just my opinion on some of this. This was designed as a combat knife, strictly as a combat knife. This was not meant for survival. It wasn't meant for, hard utility. This was meant as a combat blade. I know a lot of people use this for bushcraft and survival purposes. I would not do that if I were you. I do not recommend that for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a very thin blade. To give you some perspective, this is the SOG Navy SEAL Team Elite. Now, this was meant to be for both combat and survival purposes. Now, the survival is where that thickness comes in. If you can make that out in the camera, it's a very, very thick blade, whereas the K-Bar is only 0.165. The SEAL Team Elite knife is 0.24. Especially in bushcraft, you need a thick blade, especially when batoning through logs and things like that. But especially the tang. If you look at the tang of the SEAL Team Elite, the blade steel stays at the same thickness and runs all the way down the handle at the same width down the handle as well. So this is through and through a full tang knife. The K-Bar is not. The K-Bar has what's called a rat tail tang. So essentially, as the lines of the blade near the handle, they actually cut in before the blade steel enters the handle. So there's only a small piece of steel that's actually flush with the blade. So that's what's called a rat tail tang. There are a number of reasons they did this. However, one of the downsides is that it significantly weakens the structure of the knife. So I would not use this for bushcraft or survival. I've seen a whole lot of broken K-Bars just from people batoning through logs, and even if you're doing it correctly, like if you go in a knot in the wood or something, and there's enough torque on that blade, like I've seen K-Bars just snap right off the handle. Now you're not going to worry about that with a full tang knife. One thing that people have often seen as a mistake with this knife is that the lines of the blade, of the actual blade steel, don't match up with the lines of the handle. You can see as the lines progress, the transition actually offsets the lines at the handle guard. Now, this definitely is not a mistake, seeing as this is one of the most mass-produced knives in history. I don't think they wouldn't have caught that and just, gone with it for all of those knives. One of the functions of it is that basically it keeps the weight of the blade steel not just high, but forward. So the knife is actually centered more to the front of the handle guard than the back, which of course would help in a fighting situation because you want the blade to be getting to your enemy before your hand does. So now, one thing that is interesting in this knife is that these two blades are both standard issue knives. The difference is time. This is for special forces in modern day. This was for almost the entire U.S. military in World War II, so about 70 years apart. There's a lot of very noticeable differences, one of them being the blade grind. This is a flat ground blade, whereas this is a hollow grind. So it's slightly unusual for a combat knife to have a flat grind, simply because with a hollow grind, a thinner cut is made easier. However, as flesh moves up the width of the blade, the resistance to the blade increases exponentially, whereas with a flat grind, it's obviously very linear. Now, flat grinds are very useful for bushcraft purposes because they're very tough, much less of a chance of the edge chipping or breaking, and because when you're batoning through logs, it helps to have a linear form of resistance rather than this hollow grind with the exponentially increasing resistance. However, because of the thin blade and rat tail tang and some other features that I'll cover later in the video, I still would not recommend this for bushcraft. However, as a combat knife, this does incredibly well. Now, another one of the differences between the K-Bar Marine Combat and the SOG SEAL Team Elite is the serrations. These are what I call negative serrations, essentially rounded. That's what negative serrations are. So the point is going into the blade, whereas with positive serrations, the point is coming out. I usually prefer positive serrations because they tend to grab more, they rip more, they're more aggressive serrations. One of the reasons I believe they used negative serrations on this blade was negative serrations have less resistance when sliding into materials. So when you're sliding into flesh or body armor, anything of that nature, it doesn't rip as much. However, it's enough to provide inconsistency in the blade without stopping the blade. Whereas, if I jammed this knife into, some body armor, it would be much more likely to stop up in these serrations. It would just get, jammed up. Whereas these serrations slide into things much easier. They're just not quite as aggressive. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention about the serrations was that this uses a standard 4-3 serration arrangement. 4-3 is very standard. Negative serrations are not. So I found that kind of interesting that they use the uncommon method of negative serrations, but they still use a 4-3 serration arrangement. To give you some perspective on what a 4-3 serration arrangement is, the seal knife has a 5-4 serration arrangement. So essentially, the first number is the number of larger teeth, and the second number is the number of sections of smaller teeth. This is a 5-4 serration arrangement simply because they have a whole 1.5 inches of serrations. But these are both what are called decreasing serrations, meaning that 5-4, the number is decreasing. Increasing serration arrangements are very uncommon. Here's an example. This is a 3-4 serration arrangement. 3 larger teeth, 4 sections of smaller teeth. The main difference is that a decreasing serration arrangement presents more inconsistency in the blade. One of the only things that make serrations effective is the inconsistency. Basically, that means you have a bigger tooth on either side. So that means there's a bigger change before the straight edge. Whereas with something like this, a 3/4, that means you have sections of smaller teeth on either side, transitioning between the serrations and the straight edge. 4/3 or decreasing serration arrangements just tend to cut better, more aggressive, whereas these tend to cut finer. Now, the next thing I'm going to cover is what's called the blood groove. There's a whole lot of misconception about the blood groove. You know, some people think it's actually meant to like pool blood in there. Some people think it's to reduce the weight of the blade. That's not true. Obviously, with this shallow of an indentation, that would not be able to hold much blood, and that's at the peak of the blade face, so, you know, no blood would naturally run in there anyways if there wasn't in the blade. Now, another entirely feasible theory behind the blood groove is that essentially when you thrust into a person, the flesh tends to squeeze around the blade, and it creates a suction. That can be problematic when pulling the blade out, and so basically, blood groove is thought by some to essentially break that suction when it hits the blood groove. Now, given the blood groove's name and the fact that it appears on most combat knives, this is a perfectly legitimate theory. However, there are many other theories as to the use or the purpose of the blood groove. The blood groove, while it does very marginally reduce the weight of the blade, what I've seen as the most effective function of the blood groove is to focus the weight of the blade steel more forward onto the edge. Now, this was another reason they gave this knife a rat tail tang, was that while the balancing point is right about there, the blade steel's balancing point would be about here. So most of the weight back here is coming from this leather stamped handle. And what that does is, with the blade steel weight being so far up, is you can get a whole lot of, you know, just hacking and swinging motion into this knife. You can get a little momentum behind it. And that helps tremendously with a combat knife, especially for 7-inch blades and above. Now, next I'll cover the steel. Steel is one of the only areas in which the older knife, the Ka-Bar Marine Combat, actually thoroughly beats out the SOG SEAL Team Elite. The SOG SEAL Team is made of what's called AUS 8, which is a mid-class 3 steel, and 1095 CroVan, the steel used for USMC Ka-Bar, is a higher class 3. It's a very old, tested steel. It's very tough, yet easy to sharpen. If given the right chemical additions and heat treatment, 1095 can be considered even a low class 4, which is the class of super steels. However, 1095 CroVan is a high class 3 steel. CroVan stands for chromium and vanadium. Chromium is a substance that is often used to make harder steels stainless, and vanadium is basically increases wear resistance, so it makes it easier to sharpen without reducing the edge retention abilities. Now, 1095 CroVan was a very intelligent choice for the Ka-Bar Marine Combat because it's meant to be a combat knife. It's meant to be a tactical knife. Not only does it have those same roots of tradition of being a very old, hard, tested steel, but also it's easy to sharpen without reducing its edge retention capabilities. So in the field, it's nice to be able to sharpen your blade without having to, get a professional knife grinder. And in World War II, it was very necessary to have long-lasting edge retention because the soldiers were going to be out there for a long time. Now, 1095 is not a stainless steel. That's why it does have a powder coat on it. However, AUS 8, the steel of the SEAL Team Elite, is not stainless either. Now, the next thing I'll cover is the butt cap. Now, this is another thing that's very different about these two knives. For the SEAL Team, this is basically an extension of the tang, which is very structurally sound. However, unfortunately, it doesn't make a very good hammer because it doesn't have a very large head. It's very hard to hit something on the head accurately with this. Now, it's sort of the opposite with the K-Bar Marine Combat, because it has this very wide, round cap to hammer things with. Unfortunately, it's not part of the tang. That butt cap is only held on by this little pin right there. I have seen issues with this before when people use this as a hammer and the pin ends up coming loose. The cap will rattle around. Some people tend to think this is a wood handle. It's not. It's basically just leather washers that are slid over the tang and then polished or hardened, which is sort of another reason why they had to do a rat tail tang, was because you can't exactly have a full width tang if leather washers are going to be sliding over it. So the leather washer handle kind of restricts the width of the tang. Now, one thing I absolutely must point out about this knife, both the knife and sheath in general, and specifically relating to the leather washer handle, is that this knife gets beat up very easily. Leather washers scratch very easily, and they get gashed in, and the sheath is sort of the same way. Sort of scratches itself up. There's, a gash along here, and of course, while that does add character, something has to be said for the longevity or lifespan of the knife, how long it can actually go if it gets beaten up so easily. Alright, next I'm going to go over the sheath. So there's two sheath options. The first is the traditional leather sheath. The second sheath option is a Zytel sheath. Zytel is basically a brand name for GRN, or glass reinforced nylon. So GRN is basically just glass that doesn't shatter and is not see-through. So it's a very hard substance. It's very resilient against corrosion, and it's just very tough in general. And now if you're going to be using this knife for military operations or law enforcement or even self-defense if you so desire, I would recommend the Zytel sheath, simply because Zytel is an incredibly durable material and it really doesn't get banged up very easily. It's going to protect your blade very well. It's just very efficient, modern, adaptable, versatile. I got the leather version because, I don't know, I'm a very traditional guy, and there's so much history and tradition behind this knife. I just had to get the original leather sheath. The leather sheath, depending on what kind you get, does come with the USMC stamp, the USMC logo stamp, and K-bar. There are a few things I have to mention about this sheath, both good and bad. I'll start with the good. It's a very simple sheath design. Basically, they just have 3 pieces of leather and the middle one is cut out in the shape of a blade. That's all just stitched and riveted together. And so what they did with that center piece, they made it just barely thinner than the thickness of the blade. And so what that does is, just naturally the sheath tends to squeeze the blade when you put it in. So this can be used as a pressure sheath and it doesn't fall out. And you can see that played out right here in the bowing of the sheath, which is a good thing. Now I'll go into the bad. It's not an ambidextrous sheath, meaning you can only put the blade in one way. You can't put the blade in this way. That's not true with all fixed blades. A lot of modern fixed blade knives, you can insert the blade into the sheath in whichever direction or orientation you want. That's just a possible slight inconvenience for some people. It's not a huge deal. One of the issues with having a leather sheath is that it's high maintenance. For anything leather, you have to oil it, you have to keep it away from water, it gets scratched easily. So it's really not something that's going to be excessively durable. Now, another bad thing about the leather sheath is that with this spacer in between, what tends to happen is that the knife edge is actually contacting that spacer, and what that does is it tends to sort of rip out very small chunks of leather, just sort of like dustings that end up on the blade. It's not a huge deal, it's just something worth pointing out. Another thing worth noting is the belt loop hole of the sheath. This belt loop is huge. It extends the entire length of the handle pad of the sheath. If you put it on your belt and you get your belt tight enough, this does hold it pretty firmly. It doesn't, swing around too much. Now, the last thing I want to say in favor of this sheath is this strap right here. This handle strap is very effective because of the belly shape of the handle. It looks like it would be stopped by the handle guard, but it doesn't even get that far. So if the knife ever comes out, you're good with just this. Also, the last thing is the snap. Always choose a snap over Velcro. Obviously, you wouldn't expect Velcro to be present in a World War II knife. However, something has to be said for the longevity of a snap. Velcro is temporary, a snap will last you as long as you live. So for a recap, use this for a combat blade or for presentation blade if you must. Don't use this for bushcraft. Between the thin blade, the rat tail tang, the easily scratched handle, and the loosenable butt cap, it's just not a good choice for a survival bushcraft knife. People often ask me, what do I use this knife for? Because bushcraft is really where most of my knives get most of their use. I carry this as a pack knife. I also carry this on mountaineering trails because in the wilderness when you're above tree line, carrying a bushcraft knife isn't very practical because there's nothing to cut, there's no bush. Bushcraft kind of stops at 11,000 feet where I live. So when I go mountaineering, and I would still prefer to have a good combat utility knife, something that can do anything from self-defense on the trail to cutting, ropes, climbing ropes or harnesses, or making a tourniquet if someone gets injured. This can still do all that, but I still never use this for bushcraft. If you're looking for a knife to defend yourself with, this is a very good option. If you're looking for a knife to serve with, this is a very good option. Really anything combat related, this is going to be a great knife. If you're looking for a knife to beat on that you can just abuse and is just indestructible, go elsewhere. If you want something that you can, baton through nails and chop down trees and drive over it, go with something like this. Something with a thick blade, a full tang, a Zytel handle instead of this leather stamped handle. Something that just has a bit more durability, something that doesn't get beaten up and gashed easily. If you're a knife collector worth your salt, you've got to get your hands on one of these. So much history behind this knife. This knife has ended and saved countless lives throughout its history. I'll give you guys a good close-up view of the knife here. So there we have the rat tail tang visible through the butt cap, leather stamped handle, handle guard, USMC stamp, blood groove, negative serrations, and the 7-inch flat ground clip point blade. Standard USMC K-bar leather sheath. This is the K-bar USMC Combat Utility Mark II combat knife. $59.29 on Amazon with free shipping. This has been Ice. Thank you very much for listening, guys. Please subscribe.